The land north of Minnow Creek ran flat for 3 miles before it hit the tree line, and after that, it was spruce and muskeg all the way to the river. She had read that in the letter. The man who wrote it had not made it sound like a selling point. He had simply stated it the way he stated everything else. The size of the existing structure, the condition of the well, the number of working months before freeze-up. Here is what is here, the letter said without saying it. Decide accordingly. She had decided. She was here. The bus had let her off at the junction town, which had a gas station, a hardware store, a Tim Hortons that shared its parking lot with a Legion Hall, and a woman behind the hardware counter who knew exactly who she meant when she said the name of the ranch. 40 minutes north, the woman said. Left at the grain elevator, right at the dead poplar. Straight after that until you see the silver roof. She had a name for that kind of direction. Directions that only work if you already know the land. She thanked her and asked if there was a cab. There was not a cab. There was, however, a man loading fence posts into a half-ton who was going that way anyway. He did not speak for the 40 minutes. She watched the country out the window. It was October, and the aspens had dropped their leaves and stood white and bare against a sky the color of old tin. The road was gravel past the first turnoff. After the dead poplar, which was very dead, it was dirt packed hard by frost. She saw the silver roof before she saw anything else. Then the house beneath it. Low, set into a slight rise, with a stand of spruce breaking the north wind behind it. The barn was twice the size of the house. She noted that. The man with the fence posts turned down the drive without being asked. He stopped in the yard and had her bag out of the box before she was fully down from the cab. He set it on the ground, nodded once, and left. She stood in the yard and listened to the truck until it disappeared back into the trees. The yard was quiet. A dog appeared from around the barn, assessed her from 20 feet, and returned the way it had come. That seemed to settle the matter for everyone. She picked up her bag. The door opened before she reached the porch. He was taller than she had expected. That was the first thing. The second was that he had flour on his forearm and did not appear to notice it. He stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame and looked at her the way people look at something they have been waiting on without knowing exactly what shape it would take when it finally arrived. He said, "You made the connection at Red Deer?" She said, "There was a delay. I took the early one." He nodded as though that accounted for something he'd been calculating and now didn't need to. He stepped back to let her in. Inside was warm, wood stove in the corner going well. The kitchen took up most of the front room, with a table big enough for 4 pushed against the west wall. 2 chairs on one side, 1 on the other. She counted that without meaning to. On the counter, a bowl with dough rising under a cloth. He had been doing something useful when she knocked. She filed that away. "Coat hooks there," he said. She hung her coat. He went back to the counter. She stood in the kitchen a moment and looked at the room the way she looked at most things she would need to understand. Starting from the corners and working in. The walls were pine board, darkened from years of wood smoke. The window above the sink faced east and would be good in the mornings. A second door off the kitchen stood open an inch. A hallway, she guessed. The rest of the house. "The room's through there," he said without turning. End of the hall, last door on the left. She took her bag and found it. A narrow room with a window that faced the barn. A bed with a quilt folded back at the top corner. A chest of drawers with a water pitcher on it. A hook on the back of the door. The window had frost on the lower right edge that had not been there long enough to clear with the heat from the rest of the house. She noted this and did not say anything about it. She put her bag on the chest and went back to the kitchen. "I'll start supper," she said. He looked at her once, a quick check, then back at the dough. "There's moose in the freezer, bottom shelf." She found the freezer in a lean-to off the back of the kitchen, and the moose and a half bag of onions hanging from a nail above it. She brought what she needed and found a pan and found the oil and did not ask where anything was. She had learned a long time ago that the fastest way to understand a kitchen was to simply be in it. The things that were where you'd expect them to be told you one thing. The things that weren't told you something else. The cast iron pan was not above the stove. It was under the counter in a low cupboard to the left of the sink, with a lid balanced on top of it. She found it on the second try. She noted, "A person who uses this pan often enough to have a specific place for it." She noted the lid. Someone who keeps a lid on the pan means someone who keeps the fat from going on the stove. That was a kind of care that had become habit. She put the pan on the heat. He punched the dough down and shaped it without ceremony and set it in the bread tin and slid it into the oven. She watched his hands in her peripheral vision. Big hands, used hands, but careful with the tin the way you are. Careful with something that needs handling right to come out right. They worked in the same kitchen without getting in each other's way. He moved to the sink, and she moved to the stove. He passed behind her for the dish towel, and she had already stepped to the side without either of them, marking it as a decision. Outside the light went early, the way it does in October that far north. By the time she had the food on the table, the yard was dark and the dog had come in from somewhere and settled under the table near the stove. They sat across from each other and ate. He ate the way she recognized, the way a person eats who has been sitting down alone to meals long enough that they no longer feel the absence, not fast, not slow, just completely, without anyone to measure himself against. She was measuring him, quietly, the way she did most things. He said, "The herd's down to 63 head. I had a bad spring." She said, "What happened?" He said, "Lost 9 calves to the cold. Late storm. The forecast was wrong." He said it without blame in either direction. "Just, this happened. I've been short-handed since May." She nodded. He said, "The ad said what I need. Someone who can work. That's all it needs to be." She looked at her plate. That was not a dismissal, it was an accounting. Here is what I have. Here is what I'm asking. Here is what I am not asking. She had learned the difference between men who said that's all it needs to be to diminish and men who said it to clarify. She was fairly sure which kind this was. She had been wrong before. She would pay attention. "I know how to work," she said. He nodded once and ate the rest of his meal. After, he carried his plate to the sink and washed it himself. She noted that. She finished her own and brought it to the counter, and by then he was already by the door with his coat and his boots. "The heifer in the third pen," he said, "has been off her feed. I want to check her before dark," she said. "I'll come." He looked at her, not long. Then he opened the door. Outside was cold and clear, the sky already full of stars the way prairie skies go when the cloud cover moves off. She could see the whole of it from the yard, which was disorienting after years of cities where the sky was just a strip between buildings. She kept her face forward and followed him to the barn. Inside was warm and smelled like hay and animals and the specific mineral smell of a working barn that has been built and kept properly. He moved through it like he moved through the kitchen. Without hurry, without hesitation, every step a step he had taken before. She walked behind and watched the way he touched things as he passed. A latch, a post, the back of a cow's neck as he went by, a gesture so habitual it barely registered on his face. The heifer was in the third pen. Reddish-brown, young, standing close to the gate with her head low. He went in and stood with her a moment before he touched her. Not approaching the way you approach a problem. Approaching the way you approach a thing you want to give room to. She watched from the gate. He checked the animal with the steady attention of someone who has done it in good light and bad light, and knows what he is looking for without having to think about what to look for. After a while he said, "She'll do, probably the cold last night. I'll give her the morning." She nodded. On the way back to the house, he said, "There's a calf coming in the east pen, maybe 2 days. I can take the overnight," she said. He glanced at her. "You've done it before?" "Yes." He didn't ask what circumstances had put her in a barn at midnight in some other place. She didn't tell him. That was a fair exchange. "I'll do tonight," he said. "You'll know the animals better by tomorrow." That was practical and not unkind. She accepted it. In the house, she banked the fire the way she judged the stove needed, which was a guess, and washed the supper things, and sat at the table with the mending she had seen piled near the window when she came in. A wool sock with a heel gone, a jacket with a torn pocket seam. She found a needle and thread in the third drawer she tried, and sat down with it and the lamp on. She sewed, and the house was quiet, and outside she could hear nothing but the occasional settle of the fire, and once, distantly, the dog. She did not think about where she had come from. There was no point in it tonight. There would be a morning, and after that another morning, and she would learn what there was to learn, and that would tell her what she needed to know. She went to bed before he came back in from the barn. In the morning he was already up. She heard him when she woke, earlier than she'd meant to. the sound of boots on the kitchen floor, a cupboard opening, the stove being fed. She lay in the narrow bed and listened to the house doing its morning without her, and then she got up. He was at the window with his coffee when she came in. The yard was gray and still, a skin of new snow on the ground, thin, the kind that would be gone by noon. He didn't say anything about her being up. He poured a second cup and set it on the counter near the stove. She took it and stood at the other window, the one that faced east, and drank it while the sky went from gray to a pale, thin pink above the trees. "The calf may come early," he said. She was restless in the night. "I'll stay close to the barn this morning." He nodded. He was already pulling on his coat. He went out. She finished her coffee and dressed for cold and followed. The calf came at mid-morning, which was fast and also not fast, depending on when you started counting. She had been there long enough to know what she was seeing when it started. She did what needed doing, which was mostly staying out of the way, and once being in the way, specifically in the right place at the right time, which she did without being asked because she could see what was needed. He was on the other side. When it was done, and the calf was up on uncertain legs, and the mother was cleaning it, he looked across at her. She was already looking at the calf, but she was aware of the look. He said, "Good," one word. She had learned by the end of the first day that his words were not inflated, which meant that one word was the real thing and not a reduced version of something larger. She didn't answer. She watched the calf find its feet. There were things she learned that week that no one told her. The dog's name was Pitch, and he was particular about the barn but easy in the house, and he had decided on her somewhere in the first 2 days, and after that he was simply where she was. She did not make a thing of this. The stove in the kitchen ran hotter on the right side. She had learned this by feel on the second morning and compensated after that. He ate lunch in the barn most days, not from preference but from habit. The habit of a man who has been too busy to come in and has simply forgotten that stopping is an option. On the third day, she brought food out to the barn on a board and set it on the rail of the pen he was working in and went back to the house. She did not say anything about it. He did not say anything about it. When she came out an hour later, the board was empty and sitting beside the gate. She did not do it every day, only when the work kept him. He noticed. She knew because on the fourth day, when she came to the barn at midday, he had already pulled the board from where it leaned against the wall and set it on the rail himself, as if clearing the air on the matter. She put the food on it and left. There was a woman in town named Greta Voss who ran the feed supply. She was a large woman with a handshake like a man and opinions about everything, which she offered freely and without apology, which was the way she had with useful things. On the second Saturday, she drove him into town for the weekly run. And Greta Voss came out from behind the counter and looked her over with the directness of someone in a small place who has decided that strangers are best addressed straight on. "You're the one from outside," Greta said. It was not a question. "I am," she said. Greta looked at her hands, at her boots. She had changed for town, but the boots were work boots, and that was not something she had thought to change. "He had a woman here 2 years ago," Greta said, in the tone of someone delivering a fact they've decided is load-bearing. "City girl? Lasted 6 weeks. I'm not a city girl," she said. Greta looked at her a moment longer, then nodded, once, as if something had been entered in a ledger. "Mineral blocks are in the back," Greta said, and went around the counter. In the truck on the way home, she did not mention it. He had been in the hardware half the time and the co-op the other half. She had no way of knowing how much of that conversation he'd been in earshot of. She did not need to find out. He drove the way he did most things, without talking. The gravel road ran between bare fields, and the sky above them was the deep blue of cold, clear afternoons in that country. Pitch was in the box of the truck. She could see him in the mirror, nose up, reading the air. After a while, the man said, "Greta talks." She said, "Yes." He said, "She's not wrong about things, mostly." "I know," she said. "That's what makes it hard." He glanced at her, brief, not readable. Then back at the road. They drove the rest of the way without talking. But it was a different kind of quiet than it had been going in. The weeks found their shape. She did not plan it. She did not think she planned it. But somewhere in the second and third week, the day had a rhythm that had not been there before, and she could not say exactly when it had arrived. The early mornings with the fire and the coffee before he went out. The long middays with the animals and whatever needed doing in the outbuildings. The evenings when the light went early and the kitchen went warm, and they sat on opposite sides of the table, each with something in their hands, and the silence between them was not empty. She had known empty silences. She knew what they felt like. They felt like a held breath. This was not that. One evening he was going over a ledger. She was at the window with the curtains she'd been rehemming, the ones in the back room that had lost a rod pocket. It was not her room. She had begun to think of it as the room she would be in before the guest room, eventually when there were guests. She had not said this. She was hemming the curtains because they needed hemming. He said, without looking up from the ledger, "You sewed the pocket back on the jacket." She looked up. The jacket had been in the pile that first night. She had done it then without thinking. "It was coming apart," she said. He looked at the page in front of him for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you." She went back to the curtain. Outside, the wind had come up and was moving through the spruce in long, drawn-out surges. She listened to it and kept her needle moving. Later, when she was in bed, she thought about the way he had said it. Not the words, which were plain. The decision to say them at all. She had been with people who would not do that, who would let a thing go unthanked and then use it later. The weight of the unacknowledged favor building until it was useful to spend. She had learned to see that quality in people early. She had not always acted on what she'd seen, which was a different kind of lesson, and an older one. This man said thank you for a mended pocket. She did not make too much of it, but she filed it. Near the end of the third week, the temperature dropped hard. Not the early cold that came and went, but the real cold, the kind that locked in and stayed, and told you winter had made up its mind. The water in the barn troughs went overnight, and she was out there at first light with the heat tape and pitch beside her, and her breath going white in the beam of the headlamp. He found her there. She heard him come in and did not look up from the trough. "The east fitting was loose," she said, "and I've done that one." These two next. He crouched on the other side of the trough without a word and held the fitting steady while she tightened it. That was faster than doing it alone. That was the only reason he did it. She knew this and was glad for the practical clarity of it. When the last trough was sorted, she stood and straightened her back, and he was already at the door. "Coffee's on," he said. She went in. It was warm, and the coffee was strong, and she wrapped both hands around the mug and looked out the window at the yard, going from black to gray, and somewhere in the middle of looking at it, she was aware that this was not a place she was tolerating until something better came along. That was new. She could not say precisely when it had become new. She drank her coffee and did not say anything about it. A letter came 2 weeks in. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope before she was all the way to the mailbox. Her hands did not change how they held it. She carried it back to the house and set it on the chest in her room, and did not open it until after supper, when she was alone. It was from her brother. He was not asking anything of her, he said. He was only saying that their mother's house had been listed, which she already knew, and that it had sold, which she did not. There was a figure. The figure was smaller than she had expected. She had expected small. It was smaller than that. She read the letter twice, and then folded it back into the envelope and set it in the chest under the extra blanket. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while, with her hands in her lap. There was no point in going over it. The house had always been going to sell. She had been going to be somewhere when it sold, and here was somewhere, and that was the whole of it. She was here. That was the thing she could do something about. She went out to the kitchen and refilled the wood box from the pile on the porch, and checked the stove and went to bed. In the morning, she did not look like a woman who had done something hard in the night. Or she did, and he did not remark on it, which came to the same thing in the end. He showed her how to read the herd. Not all at once. It happened in pieces, the way things happened with him. Standing at the fence one morning, not saying anything, just watching, until she asked what he was looking at. He pointed out the heifer on the left, the one with her tail raised slightly, the one standing apart. What he said after was not a lecture. It was more like being given a language one phrase at a time, with the expectation that you'd put the grammar together yourself. She did. She was good at that. On the 5th morning she said, before he did, the roan on the south end. She's been slow coming to the gate. He looked at the roan. He looked at her. He said, I'll check her tonight. She nodded and went to get the wheelbarrow. That evening he came in from the barn and said she'd worked a bit of wire into the back left hoof. Nothing permanent. He said it the way he told her most things, simply with no extra weight put on it. Just, "This is what was there. This is what I found. This is how it went," she said. "Good." He sat down and she set supper on the table and they ate. Pitch settled under the table near her feet. He had been doing that for a week now, and neither of them had said anything about it. It was simply where the dog went. One Sunday, he drove out to a neighbor's place to help move equipment and was gone most of the day. She was alone on the property for the first time. She did not mind being alone. She had been alone often enough that it had long since stopped being a condition and become simply a state, like being warm or being cold. She did the feeding and checked the herd and found nothing that needed tending. Then she walked the fence line on the east side that she had not been down yet. The ground was frozen and the walking was easy. The sky was the flat white of a covered day, the kind that diffuses the light, so there are no shadows, and everything looks slightly more true to itself than it would in direct sun. The fence was in good repair. She could see where it had been repaired before. Not recently, but in the past, at intervals, by a person who understood that a fence not kept would become a problem long before it was an emergency. She thought about this as she walked. At the far northeast corner, there was an old stone boat, half buried in the grass, tipped on its side. Something from a longer time ago. She stopped and looked at it. The iron runner was rusted entirely through. She put her boot on it and felt it crumble. The land around it had been left to go back to grass and had done so completely. You would not know what had happened there unless you looked for it. She looked at it a while and then walked back. When he came home that evening, she had a pot of soup on and the bread she had made that morning, which had come out well. He came in cold and hung his coat and washed his hands at the sink and sat down without looking around the kitchen for what had or hadn't been done in his absence. That was a thing she had noticed and filed. There were people who kept score of what you did in their absence. He was not one of them. They ate and she said, "The east fence is good. There's an old stone boat at the northeast corner. The runner's gone." He said, "I know. It was my grandfather's." She said, "I didn't take anything." He looked at her then, a full look, not a quick one. "I know," he said. She looked back at her soup. After a while, he said, "He'd built the first barn, the one that burned in '86. She said, "Is that when they built the current one?" "The year after." He broke a piece of bread. "I was 12. I helped with the frame." He said it without particular weight, not as a story, more as a coordinate. A way of saying, "This is how old this land is to me." She ate her soup. Outside, the wind had come up again. The real wind this time, the north wind that had been building all day. It moved against the house in long pushes. The stove answered each one with a quiet breath of warmth. She thought about 12 years old and a barn frame in October and learning what she was learning now. Except that you were 12 and it was not a choice and it simply became what you were. She thought about the stone boat. The runner gone to rust, the ground come back up around it. She did not say any of this, but she stayed at the table after she finished and refilled her coffee and sat with it for a while, which she did not usually do. He was still there too, his paper in front of him, his pencil making small adjustments to something. He did not ask why she was still at the table. It did not seem to need asking. The wind worked at the north wall. The dog slept. Near the end of October, he said, as she was pulling on her coat one morning, the tanner place sold. She looked at him. 40 minutes east, he said. Good land. New people coming in from out of province, from what I heard. They'll need to learn the winters. She said, everyone does. He said, some people don't come back for the second one. She was at the door. She had her hand on the frame the way he had stood when she first arrived. She looked at him across the kitchen. The stove was between them, ticking in the cold. She said, I've had worse winters. He looked at her in that way he had, the way that was not pressing, that simply registered what was there and let it be there without reaching for it. Then he said, you'd need different boots before January. She looked down at her boots. They were good boots. They were not January boots. I'll get them, she said. She went out. The morning was the kind of blue cold that felt clean, that felt like something starting rather than something ending. Pitch came out of the barn and fell in beside her. The frost crunched in an even way under her feet. She had said she'd get January boots. She had said that plainly without making anything of it. But walking across the frozen yard, she was aware that she had said it, and that he had heard her say it, and that they had both let it stand there unchallenged in the warm kitchen. She went to check on the herd. The animals moved when they heard her. They knew her now. That was a thing that had happened without either of them working at it, simply through the days adding up. And she thought about that as she walked the fence line in the early morning. And the land lay flat and cold around her, and the light came sideways through the trees to the east, thin and gold and permanent feeling, the way light feels in October when you are somewhere that has decided to keep you. She did not make a plan. She walked the fence and came back and did the feeding and went in for the second coffee of the morning. He was at the table. She set her mug down and sat across from him. Outside, the yard was bright and cold. Inside, the stove was going, and the dog was under the table, and the bread was from yesterday but still good. He looked up from his paper. She picked up her coffee with both hands. Neither of them said anything, but the morning had a shape to it that had not been there 2 weeks ago. And she thought they both knew it, and she thought that was, for now, enough.